Right. Yeah, that dialectical relationship ultimately between ethics and adoration, responsibility and love, morality and contemplation, doing and being, and that she discovered again the medieval maxim, agere sequitur esse, that doing follows being, doing follows being. And so we live the better we contemplate who and what we are, who and what God is in God's revelation. And we see that beautiful complementarity between these two things in her thought and in her life overall, and how this paradox that her heart is so responsible for the other, but she sees how this can be lived out through Carmel, becoming a Carmelite nun. What does contemplation have to do with evangelization, missionary responsibility for the other? Everything. This both and. Um, and we see in her writings as a Carmelite nun how she understood the meaning of this Carmelite vocation, which, as she says at one point, is to stand proxy for sinners. Like it's not like egocentric movement away from responsibility, but it's actually an intensification in responsibility out of love for the other, love for God. As Saint Therese of Lisieux quotes the ancient thinker Archimedes, who said, "Give me a fulcrum and a lever, and I will lift the world." And Therese applies that and says, um, the fulcrum is God and the lever is prayer. And this is how the saints have lifted the world and will continue to lift the world to the end of time. It's so beautiful, and that's what strikes me so much about her life is this actualization of the missionary potential of the contemplative life. And it's exactly what Saint Teresa of Avila talks about too in her works, that the sisters Mary and Martha must join together, and that the further one goes into the most interior chambers of the soul, the interior castle, the more one realizes this moral perfection by the grace of God, and can serve another person at the drop of a hat, can be always available, always ready to do the will of God in big things and small. This is what we see in Saint Teresa Benedict of the Cross also. So, well, are we ready to take a step back into phenomenology? Not for too long, but just to think about this figure, Max Scheler, in the mix, a very prominent influence on Stein. Sister Herbstrith brings that forward here, beginning on page 46. But the two chapters, 3 and 4, we're reading from Herbstrith this week. What is truth? And Husserl's assistant. So I like that we can linger in this stage of Stein's life when she's studying phenomenology, when she's seeking truth with passion, and where this quest leads her. So Max Scheler, uh, he is mentioned by Herbstreit as having a prophetic philosophy. And I think in his figure, it's this intersection of Husserlian phenomenology and also German Romanticism, even. Uh, we think of writers like Goethe and Hölderlin, and just the power of the poetic, the power of ethical idealism, in that phenomenology opens an attitude. So for Shaler, it's not so much a method as an attitude, a phenomenological attitude, as a spiritual seeing. And I'll share my screen and write the German, what he means by the spiritual seeing. Geist, spirit, Geistes, spiritual Haltung, Geisteshaltung, a disposition of the spirit, you could say. This is what phenomenology opens. A serious, a critical disposition of the spirit toward spiritual givenness. Geist is this huge term in German philosophy in general. We think even going back to Hegel in the early 1800s, his book Phenomenology of Spirit, even though he's not doing a Husserlian phenomenology at that point, but there's something going on there, again, influenced by German Romanticism and this German idealism of a quest for the transcendent. For sure, beyond matter. Again, it's a very sharp critique in response to the expansion of radical empiricism and the scientific method and this reduction of all things to experimental forms of knowledge. But there's these philosophers who keep serving as the defense attorneys for spirit. And Scheler talks about phenomenology being a moral attitude of love toward reality. It's very similar to what John Paul II says. And of course, John Paul II, Wojtyła, wrote his habilitation on the ethical phenomenology of Hegel, I believe at the Jagiellonian University in Poland. So the essence of philosophical thinking for Hegel is a love-determined movement of the inmost personal self of a finite being toward participation, very Catholic word there, participation in the essential reality of all possibles. Altogether, this is a movement toward the primal essence of all essences, he says. So phenomenology is about this gathering up of given essences within lived experience. That's what the phenomena are, the essences that crash into consciousness. And Hegel talks about this Urwesen, that we could say is the essence of all essences. Another word for God, you could say, code language for God in philosophy. But the essence of all essences, we're getting at the essence of essence kind of thing with Hegel. It's a movement toward like a redoubled transcendence within thought. And then therefore it becomes mystical. It's a lift. It's a lift beyond the mundane, the ordinary, beyond the natural attitude. It's like when that natural attitude is intentionally bracketed and we enter this disposition of the spirit, this Geisteshaltung, there's a lift, a rise, and an encounter with the possibilities of love, this love-determined movement. So he doesn't hesitate to use the language of love, and that is unusual in philosophy. Jean-Luc Marion would be another contemporary phenomenologist who really has a lot to say about the phenomenality of love. He wrote this book, The Erotic Phenomenon, and I think it's all very, we see the genealogy of thought here. But again, Scheler is very similar to John Paul II, who, as I mentioned before, described phenomenology as a charitable attitude in relation to the world, to oneself, to the other, to God. This is what we find in Hegel, so or in Scheler. So we might wonder the degree of influence Scheler had on Stein because she sat in some of his seminars. But still, for her, Husserl was the master, and she became his assistant. And I think Scheler had a drift from his Catholic faith later in life. And he died early in his 50s. He smoked a lot of cigarettes every day and had health issues. But we can see him as a very influential figure within that Göttingen school and in representing many interpreters would say the more realist side of things, even though there's an idealist thrust of seeking that Urwesen. But you see, even in some of the language of Hegel, that bringing together of metaphysics and phenomenology, the language of being, but also possibility and phenomena. But for Scheler, the aim to participate in that essential reality of all possibles, this Urwesen, is what phenomenology opens up. And so for sure, we could understand his influence on Stein, really understanding the great benefits of adopting a phenomenological attitude and the spiritual way of seeing. Uh, and page 48, there's a good quote from Herbstrith, page 48, from Stein's dissertation on empathy, where we see influence of Scheler. She writes, whenever we come into contact with realms of value, that's a key term for Scheler. So what's unique to Scheler is this phenomenology of value and the givenness of values. It's a very careful term because it seems to conjure up the metaphysical notion of judgment. If there's value, I adjudicate between the hierarchy of values. So yeah, it's where we're getting that kind of blend between metaphysics and phenomenology, but we still could think of value in terms of meaning, in terms of a comparative analysis of various given phenomena. But value, we hear value in phenomenology, we think Scheler. So Stein writes in her dissertation, whenever we come into contact with realms of value that we cannot enter, we become aware of our own deficient value and unworthiness. So I think it goes back to Miles' point about graduate level studies and encountering different exhibitions of different values and realizing, okay, I have my talents, but I don't have all of them that are to be had. And so the humility must set in, and we recognize the sense of all the value is not in the ego, but there's a value that transcends the ego, thinking in terms of this Urwesen for sure. And this is how Stein eventually will talk about being itself, ipsum esse subsistens, in the scholastic language, and actus purus, pure act, being itself, absolute being, the being that has a hold on my finite being, and all these things. Again, there is a lot of influence, I think, from Scheler in these formulations, gradual formulations of Stein. So the German word for value here is Wert. I think related to our English word worth etymologically. Wert. And Scheler also talks about Wert fühlen. Wert fühlen, or feeling for values. So thinking of this phenomenological receptivity of value in terms of the phenomenality of feeling, fühlen, Fühlung. This is also reminiscent of the 19th century Friedrich Schleiermacher, thinking in theological terms of God as the sense of the feeling of absolute dependence on the otherness of God. There's a lot of common thought happening here. Yeah. We think of Rudolf Otto here, another thinker who talked about that mysterium fascinans et tremendum, this sense of facing the holy per se, but also even from the etymology of religion, if at the very least we can say from the Latin religare, where we get the English word ligament, to bind together, to hold together, ligature, ligament, and the to reinforce that. So as Paul Tillich talked about, faith is what we hold to be of ultimate concern in life, of ultimate concern, ultimate value, Schleiermacher feeling of absolute dependence. So for Scheler, this sense, at least this sense, this perception about our lived experience, that eventually we will depend on the language of God, divinity, cause, being itself, and getting into some more metaphysical things. But what Jean-Luc Marion eventually will call the saturated phenomenon or saturated phenomena, these phenomena we experience that overwhelm us, that move us, we break down in tears, something comes over us, and at least we may talk about it in affective terms, like this feeling for values. Like when we listen to music, for example, why do we like to listen to music and maybe some of the same songs over and over? What is it doing to our imagination? What kind of visual narrative is lighting up as we listen to the song, as we think about our lives, where we've been, where we've going? Is there not this register of value that's rising like the sun in our spirit? And so I think in this context, religion alone makes the human being human. Um, in terms of leaning into concepts like the absolute, concepts and questions, even better questions, like Rainer Maria Rilke in one of his passages talks about live into the questions. Don't try to answer them prematurely. This religiosity of the human spirit that insists on the truth, the fact that there is more than a world of material facts and figures. There is something, again, transcendent, something um, other, and we must talk about this in terms other than mass energy, other than matter, other than what empiricism offers. Um, and so religion, this movement toward the fullness of truth in its self-disclosure, its self-revelation, and thinking even about Heidegger in this context, is there not a religiosity in spite of his protest against it, in terms of his account of the self-revelation of being, of Sein? Um, so Edith gradually opens to this world of faith, Herbstrith says, and as was mentioned earlier today, her encounter with Adolf Reinach, who Edith considered an expert guide and teacher, who recognized in Reinach a man who was genuine, who was sincerely compassionate, who was kind, and didn't seem to have any hidden self-interest or utilitarian purpose in the interpersonal relationship. Um, and for Reinach, who eventually discovered for himself that philosophy was meant to be a means to lead to God. And I think that relates to the Herbstrith reference to Scheler also. This sense, philosophy not for its own sake, to avoid the near occasion of sophism and just arguing whatever, just to sound like one is right, but philosophy as a desperate search for wisdom and truth and those givens of that bear value to the highest, the greatest magnitude as we experience them. Even within Catholicism, this teaching about a hierarchy of truths um, is some nearby concept, I think. So um, that's why the language of love must be employed. Genealogy of hermeneutics and phenomenology, what are the key terms of all these different phenomenologists? And we move into the theological turn in the later 20th century with figures like Paul Ricoeur, Emmanuel Levinas, Jean-Luc Marion, Wojtyła, and what's the language that they're using? Love. If we had a method, it may begin and end with the first step. And as I tried to describe the method of phenomenology, which other phenomenologists too, I think, would resist the language of method in terms of what are the steps, how do you get there? It is different than what we would call the scientific method. It's not the exact same procedure. There may be some similarities there, but simply to work to bracket that natural attitude in Scheler's case is the focus. So yes, I think we would argue that every philosophy risks a methodology, and Scheler no less than anyone else, because he does bracket, then he does receive, and he does describe. He goes through what I would call the phenomenological method. But for him, the emphasis is so much on the moment of conversion that he especially describes that and what that opens. I think so, and I think that's where the eventual theological turn within phenomenology um, will go. A movement um, that begins with this bracketing of the natural attitude and a quest for the things themselves to encounter with such saturating phenomena that it's like the phenomenologist can't help but relinquish control. It's kind of like what Karl Rahner said, that Christians of the future will be mystics or there will be nothing at all. Here in a Scheler, I think that's what we eventually see in late 20th century phenomenology moving into 21st century, at least in some circles that are very attentive to religious experience and yield to, again, its magnitude, how these experiences flood consciousness, saturate consciousness, where intuition overpowers intentionality uh, to the degree that it leaves the recipient um, radically passive before what gives. And so it results in an apophatic movement of thought, of prayer, and then words become less. Uh, so um, yeah, I think one more thing to say about Shaler that may help to show the contrast between what he's doing and what some other thinkers might be doing. He contrasts this Geisteshaltung, this disposition of the spirit, with this French term, ressentiment. It's a different kind of attitude that could prevail in a person if a person does not yield to this conversion of the natural attitude. Ressentiment is worse than uh, empirical stubbornness. Scheler describes as the self-defeating attitude of hate and hardness of heart, a self-poisoning of the mind. This is what can happen. And this is where we see the intersection of phenomenology so well with Christianity. I think this call from Christ to conversion, metanoia, to enter this, in Scheler's terms, Geisteshaltung, a disposition of the spirit, to pursue the essence of all essences, to pursue in theological language the kingdom of God through the parables, for example, so that we're not left by poisoning ourselves with this ressentiment, which often can go hand in hand with the natural attitude in this life. Definitely. So, uh, though there is an inevitable genealogy of thought, we at least go back to Kant, Hegel, and forwards to Husserl. Husserl takes seriously the truth about consciousness, and he continues to concentrate that analysis on the givenness of the ego life in his more developed works called the Ideas. And that's where Edith Stein and others didn't want to follow him, because it seemed to return to this Hegelian idealism. And what happened to the things in themselves that are other than the self? It's very interesting how we use that language of phenomenology. We talk about the things themselves as if they have personality, even for the object. Now, if we're talking about a person, yes, but we might say the banana gives itself by itself as itself. It's like also the banana has a self, but it's the privileging, it's the prioritization of the otherness of the given. Even when analyzing consciousness for phenomenology, there's an otherness as the self. And Paul Ricoeur writes a book called Oneself as Another. I think Stein would like Paul Ricoeur. She would love Emmanuel Levinas. She would appreciate Jean-Luc Marion, these thinkers who come later. I don't know what she would think of Wallenfang. I think she would think he's very pretentious and thinks he understands her work, but he really doesn't. Um, but anyways, so for Stein, she wants to continue to take seriously the things themselves as other than the self, I would say. And whereas Husserl starts to move toward a more Platonic concept. At the same time, it's been said the best philosophers contradict themselves. And Edith Stein, I think, does this too in Finite and Eternal Being. If I remember right, and I do believe I at least footnote this in Human and Divine Being, she refers to herself in the introduction as more Plato than Aristotle, which is very surprising. And I wouldn't have expected her to say that. I thought she became very Aristotelian with the scholasticism that she um, embraced. Um, so it's this both and, as I said before, phenomenology, and this is how Wojtyła puts it in some of his writings, and then in Theology of the Body too. Phenomenology ultimately is a rendering of the objectivity of subjectivity, as well as the objectivity of objectivity. So there is an objectivity to human subjectivity. There's truth about what our inner life is doing, what the spiritual life, what's happening there, in relation to all that crashes into the self, outside the body, um, So for phenomenology, like uh, I don't like to make the distinction between realism and idealism because I think it's too superficial. We take seriously all that gives itself, and when we start using isms, we're caving into some kind of natural attitude, some kind of polemic, some kind of ideology. So if I say I'm a realist phenomenologist, I would say as a phenomenologist, you don't need to say that lest you leave out many givens. Or I'm an idealist phenomenologist. I would say, yeah, it's just be a phenomenologist. It's the same thing we could say about Catholicism. If someone said, uh, I'm a conservative Catholic, it's like you don't need to say that because it's enough to say I'm Catholic. I'm a liberal Catholic. You don't need to say that. We're starting to truncate the meaning of the term by qualifying. Uh, so a good Catholic, we might say, is neither liberal nor conservative because he's both. um, he's both liberal and conservative because he's neither. This kind of concept. So I think your question raises very big hermeneutical question, and that is for a genuine philosopher, the prize is the whole, you know? So deal with it because because that's the prize and it saturates. And we want to read everyone. We want to integrate the whole history of the Western philosophical tradition, and we say, and the East, whatever the non-Western one, whatever those are. We want to learn. We want to dialogue. We want to continue to think toward the whole. Um, that's a real Catholic thing to do. So, by virtue of the phenomenological reduction, it's the expansion of the horizon of thought. We notice this language in Edith Stein, the importance of the openness of the soul to the truth that gives itself, to being itself that holds the self in its being, um, to the absolute. Even quoted in the his forward uh, or editor's introduction, or no, forward, yes, of the Knowledge and Faith book, quoting John Paul II's Fides et Ratio, when John Paul II mentions um, Edith Stein as a model philosopher. And there's a twofold description of John Paul II about her and the others he lists there as model modern philosophers. Um, so number one, they exemplify a process of philosophical inquiry which was enriched by engaging the data of faith. And this is what would gradually fill the void in Stein's life as she came back to faith in God and what she believed to be the fullness of his revelation in Christ, the word become flesh. And but secondly, what speaks to this quote on page 31, she realized she never seemed to doubt that we were in the world to serve mankind. That always made sense to her. The ethical imperative, perhaps you could even say the Kantian categorical imperative. She sensed this always deep in her being. And that's the second point John Paul II makes, that attention to the spiritual journey of these masters, like Stein, can only give greater momentum to both the search for truth and the results of that search to the service of humanity. So again, it's the esse agere, being and doing, contemplatio activo, contemplation and action, both of these together. So even though perhaps in Stein's life, um, she um, had a limited contemplative view for a while, and perhaps the cart was put before the horse in terms of the ethical imperative without the at the same time deep contemplation of being, including the data of God's revelation. She nevertheless is pursuing this truth, both in its um, sacramental face and its ethical one. But the sacramental comes more gradually. Try to fast forward the remainder of this Herbstress account, and then before the break, just make some comments into essays on woman, and then come back to that. But so we observe with Herbstress that even though Stein at a certain point groped around like someone in a fog, she says, the key is that she's groping. Like St. Paul says in Acts of the Apostles, you know, he in the Areopagus, that we human beings grope for God, that we might find God. We grope for truth. So a good philosophical adage might be something like, don't stop groping, but don't take that the wrong way. You have to be careful if you're going to say that to undergraduates or something. But for the unity of the transcendentals of beauty, goodness, and truth, which she talks about, has a whole section in Finite and Eternal Being on that. But she gradually opens to the possibility of God's existence, reconsidering this question. And we wonder too how her experience as a Red Cross nurse in 1915 in the typhoid ward of the military hospital influenced this gradual conversion further. That she wanted to serve even in a field hospital on the front, but was open to whatever she was assigned, and it was the typhoid ward. As was mentioned before, she had this desire to marry. It didn't happen. She has this desire to finish her dissertation. That does happen in 1916 on empathy. But then a year later gets news of her good friend Adolf Reinach's death in battle, which was a tragic loss. And she went to visit his wife, his widowed wife, Anna, and thought she would find Anna very distraught and who knows what. But Anna seemed to have this deep hope because of the resurrection, the truth about the resurrection proclaimed in Christ and his church. And Edith says this was her first real encounter with the cross, even goes so far as to say, that was the moment my unbelief collapsed and Christ shone forth in the mystery of the cross. So really powerful what's happening in the face of great trauma, tragedy, loss. The revelation of God pours in. In this time of crisis, she meets Christ. And so she begins to study him, study his life, read the New Testament. And as someone mentioned before about the woman in the Frankfurt Cathedral, when Edith was visiting there, and this woman with her shopping basket comes in to pray as with a friend. And this was a very special experience for her too, that she says she could never forget. We could say a wild goose chase, because it was very wild what happens next, but very good. The wildness of truth and how it shows up what sometimes seem the strangest places. And she follows the trail of breadcrumbs, pun intended, in reference to the Eucharist. And eventually she will arrive. And to arrive in this journey is always to begin, as St. Teresa of Avila says. So the beauty when we follow her life, seeing fast forward into her late 30s, where she's giving these talks about woman, man, sexuality, marriage, virginity, all these things, as she's working quietly in this girls' school in Speyer, the Dominican girls' school. And toward the end of those 8 years, she's giving these talks, writing further things, studying Catholic doctrine about theological anthropology, and putting more and more pieces together. And she wants to share this good news with other people. And she does. I find it remarkable what's in this Essays on Woman. There's not a lot of pieces like this in Catholic literature. I know very few. Um, More recently, Prudence Allen's Concept of Woman, 3-volume set. Another tremendous book to read alongside this would be Gertrude von Lefort's The Eternal Woman. Very short work, but very powerful. Very Catholic, very Marian. Um, Theology of the Body, John Paul II. All these things, there's such a convergence of thought and prayer. So if we could just enter in, start to wade into uh, this section on the separate vocations of man and woman, finishing it out. We started it last week. What does she continue to um, say there? And maybe I turn it back over to you for, again, some observations, general observations of these pages 70 to 85 of Essays on Woman, the separate vocations of man and woman uh, through nature and grace. So any general observations in this text? Very rich teleology running from the Hebrew to the Christian scriptures, where the apex, the omega point, is the fullness of God's revelation in Christ, and the role of the Blessed Virgin Mary in that. And we see the typology, as you mentioned, of figures like Deborah and Judith, Esther, arriving um, into this fuller disclosure of meaning of being, a vocation within the New Testament concepts and figures. Again, the Blessed Virgin Mary, the mystery of the Church as mother, all the women disciples of Jesus, the faithful women at the foot of the cross, Saint Mary Magdalene, and other very prominent female figures running through the whole of the New Testament. So the teleology we see developing there, germinating there. Yeah, very remarkable. Identify one of the most fundamental dialectical relationships disclosed in phenomenology is that between unity and plurality, and that there's no genuine unity without a plurality to unite. If we have unity without plurality, or we try to do so, we have just a strict generic uniformity or homogeneity, and it's not something we need to work to unite. If we have plurality without unity, we can end up in divisiveness, going separate ways, isolationism, and not uniting in the end. And as Aristotle says, extremes meet. This is where the where ideology, whether to the far right or the far left, extremes meet and destructiveness. So the via media is very important for Catholic thought, and we avoid extremes precisely because we dialogue. We risk moving in the space of the dialectic. This is one of Stein's influences. The Jesuit Eric Chavara also speaks in these kinds of ways in his book Analogia Entis, the analogy of being. So we see Stein thinking through human sexuality, sexual complementarity between male and female. And they hold together as a unity of humanity because, as you say, there's difference. There's irreducible difference. Again, according to that principle of totality, body and soul of each one, there's irreducible difference, even though there's a lot of overlap, things in common. But as John Paul II argues again in Theology of the Body, that we realize the Imago Dei not so much in the moment of individual isolation as in the moment of communion, especially the vis-a-vis of male and female. And this is why Catholic Church teaches marriages between one man and one woman, because there's a genuine sexual unity that obtains because of sexual difference. And it's that unity and plurality that is the very logic of God as Trinity, the logic of Jesus in the hypostatic union of two natures united in one person, the very logic of atoms and electromagnetism, the very logic of the universe, and the logic of fecundity, procreativity. There's generation because the two become one, yet remain two. And it's a deep principle that she seems to continue to anchor her thought in this, and thereby avoiding the near occasion of ideology in one direction or another. And we sense a living tension in her thoughts. And we're tempted to want it to resolve prematurely, but instead she invites us also to live into that tension, to live into the questions, to trust truth as it gives itself along the way. So this is a great observation. Um, and her narrative here, before we take the break, maybe I just make a few quick points, and then we can respond and we can discuss after our break in just a couple minutes. But if we begin on page 70, she discusses the traces of the original order of creation, the fall, and of redemption, that we find these traces in our lived experience. We see, we notice there's a fundamental goodness of being, to use a more metaphysical term, but there's something that's happened that's distorted our experience of being, of existence. And at the same time, we sense the potential of a hope for a redemption of this being, of a restoration of what has been fallen, what seems to have been lost. And it's very interesting how on page 72, she talks about how woman protects man from his natural one-sidedness by her own harmonious development. So if what I'm saying earlier is true, that the real philosopher thinks toward the whole because believes that the prize is the whole. She's saying in all this writing that women seems to be, on the whole, better attuned to the whole than man. Because of this, not just maternal instinct, but maternal empathetic intuition in her lived experience. She's attentive to the details, like the Blessed Virgin Mary at the wedding feast. Even though the wine runs short, she's the one who notices and brings it to Jesus' attention. And it's very significant. She affirms what is unique about masculinity and femininity, about fatherhood and motherhood. And richly, I think, talks about, for example, the duties of the father, page 77. And it's very similar to what John Paul II has to say in his apostolic letter, Mulieris Dignitatem, these kinds of ways of talking about the relationship between man and woman. She says the truth, which she talks about the truth which Christ reveals. And when I reread that, I thought that's a striking statement, given her life story. That here at this point, when she's writing this essay, 1931, uh, she can say the truth which Christ reveals, the truth she was in search of all along. That is what Christ reveals because that is who he is. Truth with a face and a name, the way, the truth, the life. Um, and that she talks about a love which looks for every possible way to approach him, the truth in the flesh. Again, this language of truth and love is fundamental to understanding uh, the relationship between man and woman and what this relationship discloses to the whole church in terms of the eschatological rendezvous toward the wedding feast of the Lamb, who sowed the seed of salvation in humanity. We think of in the early church fathers the logo spermatikoi, the seeds of the word sown across cultures and peoples. But it's Christ who is the sower, so oftentimes implicit and other times more explicit. But it is overall a movement from implicit encounter with Christ to explicit encounter with Christ in the fullness of his church through these germinating seeds of grace. Page 78, the wife and mother, according to her nature, is called to carry more than half of the load in marriage. It's a very careful thing to quote what's being said there. It's not saying man should be concerned less about the raising of the children and the domestic life, domestic church, but woman, because of her privilege of recognizing, empathizing, noticing, empathizing with the whole, with all the people in her charge, in her care, through this uh, powerful maternal intuition, man has to learn from her, and there's going to be a complementarity, uh, not only of roles, but also of persons within the sacrament of marriage, the married life. Um, and we'll come back to the question of priesthood for women after the break. But the last thing I want to just highlight, page 84, she says the most sublime vocation for women across the board is to be the spouse of Christ, to understand what that means. Spouse of Christ. The church is the bride of Christ. So again, what I think a big takeaway I have from reading Stein on these points is that as a man, I have to continue to learn from my female counterpart. I could say beginning with my wife, in my case, to learn what it is to receive the gift of salvation, to learn what it is to love other people with an empathy that embraces the whole of their person, the whole of their history, like a mother in relation to the child. Um, it's incredibly rich, and you know, the thought I have is would that everyone would get a chance to read these essays, or at least a couple of the major ones, if these were studied and at least put in the greater conversation within the social behavioral sciences, um, to let this too be a conversation partner. Um, I think it's articulated so well. So why don't we have our 10-minute break and come back for 11:13 and then go back, see your responses to those points or maybe others, and then especially track with her when she raises the question of priesthood and women. Um, I put them in their historical context too. And as someone mentioned, she admits it's what post-World War One times, and a lot of social upheaval happened because of that. World War One, a lot was to come then with World War Two further, and pushing through the 20th century. What other social changes have happened, cultural changes? I mentioned the sexual revolution before, and Brian Bransfield has, I think, a really nice narrative in his book, The Human Person According to John Paul II, where he talks about these three revolutions that happened, beginning with the Industrial Revolution, especially the 19th century and through the 19th century into the 20th century, which is well underway in Stein's time. Then the sexual revolution of the 1960s, and then the technological revolution that comes through the 80s, 90s, 2000s with the internet and all related, mobile devices, all related technologies, and how this is shaping our anthropology in for good and for bad. So it seems she's suggesting the quote, as you mentioned, that unique to woman is her singular sensitivity to moral values, as if in an innate way. And it almost presupposes that her development and moral formation happened in an environment of this ambiance of order and beauty conducive to that development. And so the moral disposition of a woman, as well as for a man, depends largely on the environment in which their conscience was formed or lack thereof. Uh, what are those planes of development, as Maria Montessori would call them, throughout life? And was a woman able to be formed and developed according to this conation or striving for moral perfection, the will yearning for what is good. And of course, by now it varies so much. But at her time, this seemed a more natural thing. And again, she's one of the first women to get the doctorate in philosophy in the European universities. And so what else were women doing right before that? And was their formation such that their environments lent themselves more to this proper beneficial moral development? So I think, yeah, I too resonate with what she's saying there. And John Paul II talks about this in Theology of the Body. It's precisely why Nahash, the serpent, approaches Hava, the woman. Because if he can dupe her, the man will follow. And Gertrude von der Fort, in her book, The Eternal Woman, says similar things, that the moral fabric of a culture depends largely on woman, what's happening with woman. And if she's ousted and goes off track, we could say as the more powerful moral agent, as cultural consciousness itself, then the battle is lost. So if women, for example, want to give up their womanhood, and not live into it, and not embrace this feminine genius, this maternal aptitude in relation to the rest of reality. When there's an eclipse of motherhood, this is a very big issue. and again, not to put any fault on women or blame on women or something like this, but there's something here about the power of um, the feminine uh, intuition of the moral life that is meant to lead the way for men too. In his book, Crossing the Threshold of Hope, John Paul II narrates original sin as the eclipse of fatherhood, the fatherhood of God. At the same time, we might fill out the description and talk about the eclipse of motherhood with Eve and the necessary victory of motherhood with the Blessed Virgin Mary that will come and is anticipated in the Proto-Evangelium in Genesis chapter 3. So, yeah, these are some of my thoughts. Yeah, so I think a big question here relates to this question about why are women not admitted to the ministerial priesthood in the Catholic Church, in Orthodox churches too, but by now, virtually all other Protestant denominations, they are. Um, but what does she say about this? And how did you receive what she had to say, especially page 83 to the end? Yeah, there's a key document of 2002, with the one you mentioned, the study of the International Theological Commission. It's entitled From the Diaconia of Christ to the Diaconia of the Apostles. And that's that first major study by the International Theological Commission on the question, historical question and theological question. Were there women deaconesses in the early church? To what capacity, what roles? Was there actual ordination or not? Was it in the same kind of form as the other orders? So it's a very well done study. So I especially referred to that. And yeah, and it's so interesting if we follow I mean, I want more discussion to happen before I share more references to more church documents since the time of Edith Stein that deal with some of these questions more definitively. But yeah, she seems only with the one reference to take for granted there were deacons in the early church, so she's convinced. But of course, we'd want to do multiple studies and put them in conversation. And that's what the 2002 document certainly is doing. um, and and be very precise about what does these biblical texts mean here. Diakonia in the Greek in reference to women, um, and, and what's happened since then within the church, the uh, parish setting, the monastic setting, where are these terms being used in reference to who? Other thoughts? Yeah, so what does she, yeah, it's very true. And in that 2002 document, we have, yeah, direct reference to so the Eastern rites of the church and some of the councils of the bishops there, where there is more evidence for the deaconesses and the function within the church there. So yeah, it's a great document to read. But then overall, what does she argue? Should women be allowed to be priests? Yeah. So thinking about how this sexual complementarity plays out, as you mentioned earlier, in a spiritual complementarity with the Francis, Clare, Benedict, Scholastica, John and Teresa, so on. In the church, on the whole, what is the complementarity between what we could call spiritual fatherhood and spiritual motherhood in the church that are not uh, interchangeable by their essences? By their essences. So both phenomenology and metaphysics, each in their own way, identify, in the case of phenomenology, these universal essences that give themselves in terms of meaning and signification. What is the meaning of masculinity? There is a stable universal one. It es gibt. Masculinity es gibt. What gives when we say masculinity? What lights up? To what does the signifier refer? The word refer to the thing itself. What is masculinity? What is man? What is father? What is husband? In relation to what is woman? What is wife? What is femininity? What gives? What gives each on its own? What gives in their complementarity? What's the meaning of procreativity in relation to sexual complementarity? Something from man, something from woman, and for metaphysics, its parts. What is, according to that ontological principle of totality about the person, body and soul? So both of these angles help us to discover the truth about the being and the thing that gives, both of these things together. So uh, I just want to say, I'm not going to write on the type out as it takes too long, but just, and then we're recording the video. So if you want to come back or jot down some notes about the documents, I think to look at in conversation with Stein is saying documents that have come out since her time. Some have been mentioned here. Um, but first, there's the declaration of what used to be called the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith of 1976 under Pope Paul VI, who signed off on it, called Inter Insignores, that deals with the question of women priests. And then it's reinforced what's said there and quoted by the Apostolic Letter of 1994 of John Paul II called Ordinatio Sacerdotalis. Um, and that's probably the most definitive statement that rules out the open theological question, could women be admitted to the ministerial priesthood? That's the most definitive teaching in the line of them so far. And then we have the Code of Canon Law, Canon 1024 says as much, who can receive the sacrament of holy orders, a man, vir. And then Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 1577. This is said. And then, but also there's a very important thing that must be read. Pope Francis, his response to the dubia of Cardinals Burke and Brandmüller of September 2023. Because one of the questions in those dubia is about women being admitted to the ministerial priesthood. And how he responds is very important. And it's ultimately a dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith document. So the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith is now called the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, the DCF. So in that, Pope Francis is responding to question 4. And I should read it. We have some time. I should just read that because it's very important. Again, we're looking for the both and. We're looking for this and that. I think Catholicism, we could say, is this and that too. St. Thomas Aquinas often would write non solum, X, sed etiam, Y. Not only this, but also that. What is the et? What is the and? That needs to be spoken, that needs to be thought. So in question 4, and I would refer to this directly. Maybe I can even email some links to these two, would be helpful. But question 4, Pope Francis is responding, When St. John Paul II taught that we must affirm definitively the impossibility of conferring priestly ordination on women, he was in no way denigrating women and giving a supreme power to men. St. John Paul II also affirmed other things. For example, when we speak of priestly authority, quoting here from John Paul II, Christi Fidelis Laici, paragraph 51, we are in the realm of function, not of dignity and holiness. These are words that we have not sufficiently embraced, Pope Francis is saying in the church. Then again, in reference to John Paul II, he also clearly sustained that while the priest alone presides at the Eucharist, the tasks do not favor the superiority of one over the other. Again, quoting from Christi Fidelis Laici and Inter Insignores. John Paul II also stated that while the priestly function is hierarchical, it should not be understood as a form of domination, but is totally ordered to the holiness of the members of Christ, quoting there from Mulieris Dignitatem, paragraph 27. If this fact is not understood, and the practical consequences are not drawn from these distinctions, it will be difficult to accept that the priesthood is reserved only for men. We will likewise not be able to recognize the rights of women or the need for them to participate in various ways in the leadership of the church. So it says, yeah, so I think that's a powerful statement by Pope Francis, and fills out what needs to be said. So I would refer to that too. And finally, I might sum up, the Catholic teaching on this question, just for the sake of a kind of catechetical moment. What I understand the teaching, where I understand it to be coming from. So I would say, why only men admitted to the ministerial priesthood? And I would say there's 5 primary theological reasons within the teaching of the church. And the first, just very briefly here, because I think it's good to get these things on the table to think about them together. And because if someone were to ask you, why does the Catholic Church teach that women can't be ministerial priests? What do you say in response? Do we understand the teaching and why? So the first thing that is mentioned is, when it said the constant tradition of the church, there's not women priests. Okay, but the 12 apostles are all men, more specifically, more to the point, that Jesus could have called women to this group that are called apostoloi in the Greek, and the 12, in the Gospels, but they're all men, and that was a definite decision of Jesus, and that's even Edith Stein is referencing that too, that even his mother was not among the 12 apostles, so they're men. Second, Jesus himself is a man. He's human. It's very interesting in the creed. We profess that when God became man, even in the Greek, became anthropos. So not the Greek word for man per se, but became human. And it's similar to the Hebrew ha'adam, which encompasses all of humanity, male and female, as a term. But nevertheless, Jesus is a man, or say a Latin, a vir, and this is significant. For, we could say, the liturgical choreography, which signifies how salvation works. The metaphorical liturgical choreography, which then we would point to the natural resemblance of a man to Christ the man. So when we're talking about acting in persona Christi in the context of the liturgy, going back to St. Thomas Aquinas, who says that sacramental signs represent what they signify by natural resemblance. This is quoted in these church documents. That it's fitting that there should be a natural resemblance between the sign and what it is signifying. In this case, Christ the bridegroom, who in relation to his bride, the church. And so there's an embodiment in Christ the man of what we could call the masculine genius, which does have an important function to relate. What is this gift of salvation from God? So to speak the words of the consecration of the Eucharist, take this and eat this is my body given up for you. It's the words of the bridegroom to the bride. It's the initiation of the gift from God, which, again, within the liturgical symbolism, it's fitting that a man would speak these words to represent and stand in the place of Christ, the man, the bridegroom, to his bride. And I think, we could say, for example, it's only fitting that a woman would play the role of Mary in the Christmas pageant or something, because only a woman can bear a child in her womb. Man cannot do this. And only the word could become flesh only through woman. And this is essential too. So the church we can think of in persona Mariae in the singular instance of the virginal conception of Jesus in Mary. This only could be through woman. So similarly, to speak the words of the bridegroom in this liturgical sense, it's fitting that a man is speaking this. And the two other points, therefore, we understand the ministerial priesthood to exercise spiritual fatherhood in the church, and only a man can be a father. So if we're talking about the essentiality and the universality of the meaning and being of a father, this is for a man. Likewise, if we're talking about spiritual motherhood, this is something only a woman could do specifically. And then last, again, going back to the first general point, we're looking at altogether the historical, theological, and doctrinal tradition of the church, altogether in itself, in its coherence, and in its wholeness. So again, to say these points, it's also necessary that we would fill out the meaning of spiritual woman in an equal way, as an immediate corollary to what's said here about men and their role in the church. But I just like to lay these things out and thinking about it to help, I guess, focus the attention on what are those philosophical and theological, what's the rationale within the teaching of the church itself. And I think there's a lot of nuance in the responses to the dubia. But yeah, Pope Francis is saying something there. And then it's also say we shouldn't interpret it as therefore get ready. He's about to announce, women can be priests. He's just saying, theologically, theoretically, we have to make distinctions where they're necessary to be made, and there, it hasn't been an ex cathedra statement about this, or a really solemn dogmatic. But what John Paul II did, which he does acknowledge in the apostolic letter, which was again, as mentioned, prior to Stein's canonization, but the apostolic letter of John Paul II of 1994, so 4 years before her canonization, Ordinatio Sacerdotalis, Pope Francis also is referencing this very strongly. But there's that open-ended questioning in a very careful, critical, theological way, but making distinctions where they need to be made. So yeah, much nuance involved. So it's good to discuss some of this. And I see we still have 8 golden minutes just to make some small reference to human and divine being, because I'm very curious to hear your thoughts and hope you're reading now into chapter 2 there. in next class next week, I'll plan to maybe spend more time on this chapter 2 of Human and Divine Being as we finish it up with next week's readings. But again, I hope what you're seeing there is a lot of excerpts of Stein that are very important coming out of her mature work. And speaking of that, on this question of ordination of women to the priesthood, she says things a bit different a year later in her 1932, so it's chapter 3 in Essays on Women, when she passes by that question again, which I think it's important to situate every text of Stein in relation to the whole corpus of her work. That what she says here on page 84, she seems to have formulated a more firm thing. If you look at pages 123, 124, Essays on Woman, which we will read later, and page 161, you can note that and compare what she says a year later to what she said in 1931. So just I wanted to point that out too before I forgot. But so Human and Divine Being, chapter 2 on spiritual being. I guess just looking for some reactions before we end today. Right. Yeah. So this logic of paradoxical logic we find throughout the Gospels, and something like the metaphysical relationship between form and matter, act and potency. This both and hermeneutic, this comprehensive hermeneutic in thinking toward the whole and receiving the whole within lived experience, and classifying and defining the various parts of the whole. So Desjardins is both a theologian, paleontologist. He's someone who brings together in his thinking well, taking seriously the stuff of natural science with philosophical and theological reflection. And so he's, issuing a critique, which, yeah, I'm engaged in a pretty strong polemic here, using Stein's thought against what could be called scientism, or what I call in the book material reductionism. And Desjardins helpful because he's calling out this blind scientism that where he says, stifled by the words they have invented, men are in danger of losing sight of the problem. They have reached the point of no longer grasping the meaning of what their own experiments are discovering. And phenomenology, especially, is the quest to gather up all the meaning within lived experience. The deep meanings, the hidden meanings, the transcendent meanings that would be the ultimate source of motivation to act. So Desjardins in all of his work, I think, is a great figure to really commence the important polemic against the neo-atheist movement that is very strong in the culture, in secularism today, calling people to search together for, once again, the meaning of meaning and all that it means. Look at the figure on page 39 in the book, and the concentric circles, each one enveloping the other, and as you said, divine being, infinite being, the raison d'etre, the reason for all the other kinds of being in the created universe. And so it's kind of unfair that I would position God as like just another part of the whole, whereas for the Judeo-Christian tradition, God is wholly other than creation. And so the graphic doesn't do justice to the radical otherness of divine being, that in its own right is sufficient unto itself. It doesn't need to create the universe, and finite spiritual being, material being in all of its potencies. So the divine freedom would be reinforced due to the cosmic gap between divine being per se and any kind of creaturely being. And in chapter 6, entitled The Antinomy of Material Being, antinomy in relation to spiritual being, that, as Stein says, at what point the totally other to divine being would be prima materia, prime matter, pure potency. If God is pure act, um, the um, the great contrast would be pure potency. But we only say this all through the analogia entis about God, the through the analogy of being, that whenever we're talking about God and predicating things of God, it's only by way of analogy, and where we're making points of similarity, as St. Thomas Aquinas says, there's always greater dissimilarity. And so a categorical distinction, the ontological difference between being itself and beings who have a share in being itself, um, and that the only type of being whose essence is existence is divinity, and no creature can say that. So yeah, the analogia entis, I would say, is the hermeneutical key to situate the radical otherness of divine being, and to admits divine freedom in the creation of the universe, not out of necessity.